2018 was a busy year at the state capitol, and with November's blue wave election, what's in store for 2019? We'll ask two observers of state politics, Dan Walters with CALmatters and Scott Lay with The Nooner, California's political update.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California channel at the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. As Jerry Brown cleared his desk for the final time as governor of California, he tweeted the following: 16 years and nearly 20,000 bills later, the desk is clear. Hashtag Eureka. So we're joined by two observers of state politics to get their take on the past legislative session. Dan Walters, of course, longtime columnist on state politics, now with CalMatters, and Scott Lay, who writes The Nooner, a daily afternoon update on California political and legislative news. Welcome to the Maddy Report. So, Scott, let me start with you. You're the new one here. So let me ask you this. So lawmakers introduced more than 24 bills responding to the Me Too movement against sexual harassment and misconduct. What was signed? What was vetoed? What's your takeaway?
My takeaway was there was a great willingness to change policies and procedures, which are essentially, we're changing ourselves now, and whatever happens in the future will happen in the future. Because the legislation that was largely proposed would have affected private businesses. In particular, the prohibition of binding arbitration agreements, for example, in employment contracts. That will be back again this session, but in particular, the tech community gets really concerned when you start talking about banning binding arbitration.
Yeah, and the arbitration thing is interesting is one of the people who are really supporting banning that was Jennifer Seibel Newsom, the new governor's wife. So right. That's going to be interesting. What do you think? What's your take on
Well, it's
this?
interesting that bill's an interesting another. It's the only bill that the State Chamber of Commerce opposed, calling them job killers. It was the only one of the job killers that made it to Jerry Brown's desk, and he vetoed it, which meant the State Chamber of Commerce did 100% kill ratio this year.
They've got a pretty good batting average.
Yeah, but I think the thing about the Me Too bills was some of them made it to Jerry. Some of them he took some. It's a typical Jerry, paddle on the left, paddle on the right, as we talked about earlier. I think the most interesting one, though, is that it does kind of make it easier to sue for sexual harassment. It expands the opportunity to sue. At least that's what the business community sees like. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, whether it does result in a flurry of lawsuits.
One of the ways he did that, they said there was a single incident of harassment could constitute enough. And so it's a nibbling at that.
Of course, he didn't sign them all. He said some of them went too far.
Right.
And so,
right. Well, let's talk about another thing. Immigration. That's primarily a federal issue, Dan, but it didn't stop the legislature from weighing in. What happened there?
Well, most of the fight over immigration is being waged in the courts by the Attorney General, Javier Becerra. But there were a couple of bills that got to Jerry that he vetoed. One of them would allow non-citizens to serve on boards and commissions, for example. The other one, what is the other one?
I think it was one where he said he didn't want to sign this bill that would prohibit any civil arrest of someone.
That's right. The other one,
who attended a judicial
the bill
proceedings.
said it would have prohibited arrest in the courthouse.
Right. It was a word about unintended consequences.
He says that a lot about bills, unintended consequences. Well, I have to write another book about California politics. It's going to be called Unintended Consequences.
But we did have, I believe it was in Fresno County, where ICE agents were actually patrolling the halls. They weren't in a courtroom, but they were patrolling the halls.
The sheriff down there is supportive of that. But Scott, let me ask you this on gun control. That was another area where Governor Brown continued to sign some bills, not others. What happened with gun control?
Well, I mean, the big bill I think that's being talked about is adding the age of 21 for the purchase of long guns, which aligns it with handguns. Right. Still opposed greatly by the Second Amendment champions, but one that just was not defendable from a political standpoint when you said, we already do this for handguns. It's not all that big of a problem. Why not do it for long guns?
Yeah, and
there was another bill that essentially makes it easier to take guns away from people who look like they're going to be dangerous for mental reasons, for other reasons. So it was not what you call a big year in gun control. That stuff was done the previous year in some legislation and a ballot measure sponsored by the incoming governor, Gavin Newsom. That was the big gun control stuff. But this year was kind of an off year for gun control.
I think we did one. Wasn't there a ban on certain alcohol crimes or certain alcohol convictions could get you on a no-buy list?
And they got the bump stocks. They took those out.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, Dan. Crime and public safety, that's always a big concern. Anything happened there that got your
The
attention?
big one, I think, was the bill that eliminates cash bail. And it was the latest incarnation of a several-year, I don't know if it's a loosening up or changing or modifying California's criminal laws to make them less punitive. In this case, by barring cash bail, supposedly people will be evaluated on their flight risk rather than they stay locked up because they can't put up bail. Now, that's going to be the subject of a referendum, which means the law will be suspended until the referendum is sponsored by the bail bond agents, gets decided by voters in 2020. It's going to be a huge battle. There's a lot of money at stake, and stay tuned on that one.
One more on crime and punishment is the tightening up of what we call the felony murder rule, which is a first-year law student learns about felony murder, which is if a murder or if a death happens in the
Commission of a felony.
commission of a felony, then you can be charged with murder. This now tightens that up and makes it requires more of intent or negligence of a death, and not just somebody slipping on a banana peel chasing after you out of a convenience
Yeah, and in
store.
fact, the way the law is read, if the police shoot somebody, they shoot one of two felons that committed an armed robbery. The surviving felon can be charged with murder because the police killed his partner.
Yeah.
Now, let me say, on the other side of this thing, it's also been a very valuable tool for prosecutors to get people who are involved in crimes involving more than one person to say, hey, we're going to go to jail on a felony murder rule if you don't tell us what went on here. And so it takes a tool away from prosecutors as well.
Up next, we're going to talk about Jerry Brown's unfinished agenda. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with two observers of state politics, Dan Walters and Scott Lay. So Dan, Governor Brown's California water fix, the Delta Twins Tunnel project, remains in limbo. And by the way, water bond went down this last November. What's going to happen with the perennial issue of water?
What's going to happen? Well, as we speak, literally as we speak, they are announcing a tentative deal on putting more water into the Delta from farmers along the San Joaquin River watershed in return for some other stuff. In other words, it's one of those everybody gets a little something type deals. And it also involves some action in Washington on reauthorizing a certain law that could put more money into water in California. This is like a five-cushion billiards game going on. And then the final part of it is, of course, the tunnels that the governor wants to build underneath the San Joaquin, Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is obviously, if that happens, it's affected by these other things that are happening. Everything is part of a little game to be played. You got to get everything in place. Will it happen? Will the tunnels happen? Will the deal happen? At this moment, as we're speaking here, who knows?
So there you go. I want to ask Scott about high-speed rail. It's another one of Jerry Brown's legacy projects. They've got new leadership, we've got a new business plan, and we've got a highly critical report by the state auditor. What's going on with high-speed rail, you think, going forward?
Well, the polling does not look good at this point. If voters were asked at this point to authorize bonds for high-speed rail, they would say no. That's pretty clear in all the polling that I've seen so far, and that's across the board, on demographics.
Well, Newsom says he seems to support this. I mean, Dan, one of the things, he's kind of like saying half a loaf. Like with the twin tunnels, I'll build you one tunnel, not two. With high-speed rail, I'll build you half a high-speed rail, but not the full thing.
Yeah, just one rail rather than two rails.
Well, the valley-to-valley side.
No, look, Newsom has kind of been all over the map on both of these issues. For it, against it, halfway for it, halfway against it. But at a certain point, he's got to kind of fish or cut bait on the train. They've got enough money maybe to finish the segment in the San Joaquin Valley from Chowchilla to an orchard near Shafter.
I think they're getting it all the way down to Bakersfield with the latest business plan.
Well, in the business plan there, but not in the construction plan.
Right.
That only goes to an orchard near Shafter. But that was supposed to be finished last year, and now they've got an extension till 2022, or otherwise they have to lose the federal money. But you know, you can't go on with this thing forever. At a certain point, you have to fish or cut bait, and right now they don't have the $20 or so billion that would be necessary to connect Chowchilla with the San Jose area by tunneling through the Pacheco Pass.
Well, they're going to talk
and
about
that's the segment that it would have to be built to have a system.
But they're talking about leveraging the cap and trade money to get the money to build that segment.
They're talking about it, but they can't. The cap and trade money is not enough to leverage that much money.
Well,
that's the thing.
I guess we're going to find out. Let me ask you this, Dan. There's another big issue out there, and that is this wall of debt, unfunded liabilities, specifically public employee retirement benefits. You know, Jerry Brown's tried to do something on that issue, but it looks like the courts are really going to have the final say here with this issue on the California rule, this idea that once you get this right, it's a vested right, can't be cut unless it's offset by a comparable new benefit, so it really has no savings. Whatever the court's going to rule, Newsom and the legislature are going to have to deal with it.
Not necessarily. The state does not have a pension problem. The pension problem is to be found in local governments and school districts. It's their pension problem. The state itself doesn't have a problem covering its pension obligations. So there's a question whether the state can do anything more than it's done. The real action would be in local government if and when the Supreme Court says the California rule that you mentioned earlier is no longer as absolute as everybody has assumed it would be. If they rule that, then it opens the door for local governments to go back and renegotiate their deals with their employees and perhaps freeze pension benefits at the current level and then reduce them for work going forward. But we don't know. The court could make a very narrow ruling in the cases that are before it and leave the California rule intact, at which case then who knows whether
And courts have a tendency to nibble. They don't typically go for big bites necessarily. They kind of incrementally.
The governor actually wants a big bite.
I know he does, but the courts may be a little different. Scott, let me ask this last question. I'm going to ask about another legacy is this budget surplus that Brown is leaving the state. You know, it seems like, you know, Governor Brown, the LAO, is saying don't put this into new programs. You know, things could go sideways in the future. But the legislature's thinking, we got to show that we can do something. The new governor wants to show they can do something. It's going to be too tempting to spend that money.
I very much likely. I think that, you know, Governor Newsom, or Governor-elect Newsom, as we're doing this taping, is actually putting the final touches on his budget, which has to go to bed, as we'd say, by the holiday. And so they're doing it, and the good news for them is the stock market downturn over the last couple of weeks, because they now have a rationale to lowball revenue numbers come January.
Yeah, you could almost say that's been happening throughout 2018. I mean, it's not been exactly an upswing. It's up and down and up and down.
But even with that, we're talking about coming into a year with $5 billion of new one-time money and $11 billion of new ongoing money. Now, of the ongoing money, $1.2 billion has to be put into the budget stabilization account. Another 2.1 billion is already committed for schools and other obligations. So you have about $8 billion. I could see a split the baby deal on the ongoing money of a little bit more into savings and a little bit more into new programs. There's a long list of new programs, and then spend a lot of that one-time money and make the interest rates
I guess we're going to see.
I think child care or early childhood education is likely to get the lion's share of any new money.
Yeah, I guess we'll see. But we're going to talk some more about some of the big policy issues in 2019 in a moment. This is the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.
Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with two observers of state politics, Dan Walters and Scott Lay. Dan, housing affordability, big deal. It's been a big challenge. What are we going to see on that issue?
Well, the key to housing affordability is to remove the shackles on construction. And everybody's talked about it, forcing local communities to accept the housing that they otherwise wouldn't accept because of the NIMBY syndrome. Whether you reform the Environmental Quality Act or you put some teeth into the state's housing quotas, it's tricky. It's tricky because the resistance to that housing tends to be in the coastal areas that vote Democratic. Right. And so it's very difficult for a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature to tell these people, no, you've got to start accepting more housing in your neighborhood.
And it's really clear that there isn't enough government money to fix this problem. It's going to have
it has to be private money,
sector.
and it just has to be because there's no government.
Well, Dan, let me ask you this. Another big issue is going to be preschool for kids lower middle income households. It's been discussed for several years. Is this the year it's going to happen?
Definitely. In my mind, definitely.
Okay.
And you never say that around the Capitol.
Right.
But the alignment is there of political interests of the governor and several key legislators, and the money is there. That I think they're going to take a bite out of this apple. It's a high priority among voters.
And it might be the first one up. You know, another one, education issue, Dan, is adding a second year of community college free for students. First year is already free, adding a second year. Think that's going to happen?
I think it's highly likely, or at least highly probable. It's not terribly expensive, and it is popular. The latest polling showed it's one of the more popular things that government could do and the new governor could do.
Yeah. Any comments on that? What do you think?
It's dirt. Well, I was a longtime community college lobbyist, so $50 million is, as we call around here, budget dust.
Budget dust, right.
Out of a $8 billion or so community college budget.
Let me ask you this, Scott. I mean, 2018 was a horrendous year for wildfires. Jerry Brown said we're living in the new abnormal. What's the likely response going to be from the legislature and the governor?
Well, the first priority is to figure out what the heck to do with 2018 fires, because the big bill that they passed last year, SB 901, covered fires that happened before January 1st, 2018, and fires after January 1st, 2019. And there were clear reasons to do that, but they've got this donut hole to fill. They have to tackle that. And then, as part of that is the discussion of prevention going forward. Right. And then I think a bigger conversation of how much money the state should pony up for prevention as opposed to private interests. And that's an issue that really wasn't dealt with over the last couple of years.
There are a couple of more issues in that, including whether we should be building houses near fire territory. And that's a huge thing.
Here we go to housing again and the NIMBY and all of that.
Huge thing, yeah.
Dan, let me ask you this. So there's some big perennial issues that you hear people talk about. Tax reform, for example. CEQA reform, you mentioned earlier. Are we going to see anything on those issues this year?
They're big, they're difficult, bordering on impossibility. Jerry Brown talked about CEQA reform as being the Lord's work, but turned out to be an agnostic on that. And he's acknowledged the need for tax reform, but says basically, I don't want to take it on because it's too tough and you can't do it. However, if we get another recession and the state's budget takes a big nosedive, that reserve fund will be quickly exhausted. And we might have to have some more talk about trying to make California's revenues less volatile and more stable, and that means tax.
Well, we do have a ballot measure that's already qualified for 2020 on taxing industrial and commercial properties differently than residential. So there is a very big reason to negotiate some sort of deal this year to stop that from going to the ballot, because you're talking about $100 million cost on commercial builders.
So maybe we will see something. Well, up next, we're going to talk about California's challenge to President Trump in 2019. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. Well, it appeared that in last November's election, the Trump card, so to speak, for Democrats was simply being anti-Trump. Some have suggested that there's going to be a growing constellation of bills in the California legislature challenging Trump in 2019. Are we going to see that? We're talking with Dan Walters and Scott Lay about California politics. So Scott, let me ask you this. Immigration policies, that's a federal issue. Doesn't mean the state's not going to step in and try to do something. What do you think is going to happen in terms of the state responding to Trump on immigration?
Well, the state's, I think, winning on that issue. The voters are very much in favor of a path to citizenship. They get a little bit uneven about what do you do about, generally the concept of undocumented immigrants coming in now, so the folks that are at the border as we tape. I think the legislature's got their sanctuary state law now, and it's in the courts. But you look at what happened in the elections in Los Angeles County, where the incumbent sheriff lost largely over the issue of assisting the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency in immigration enforcement. So I think that the feeling is it's something we just don't want to touch. Both parties defend sanctuary state, and we don't need to go any further.
And you think about immigration, how it impacts the state's economy, the agriculture, service sector, et cetera. I want to ask you, Dan, about health care, though. That's another issue where Trump and California seem to be just part company. What do you think is going to happen out of Sacramento in opposition to Trump on health care?
Well, there'll be some effort to try to, the way that Trump is recasting Obamacare is going to cut some people off, or probably not cut them off, but disencourage them from joining, I should say, because without the individual mandate. In other words, so there may be an effort to try to put in a state individual mandate to prop up the Obamacare rules. The second thing I think is interesting is that legislation that would essentially counteract the regulatory pullbacks by the Trump administration, particularly on environmental stuff, by saying that you have to keep at the state level all these regulations that the Trumps are pulling back at the federal level. I think there'll be a lot of sentiment for that, and it probably will go through in some form.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you, Scott, about those environmental issues. That's another area where California, of course, and President Trump are at odds. How do you think that California's going to respond to all these things at the federal level? It's coming out of Washington on the environment.
I think that California will test the bounds of federalism.
The new Texas, right?
Right.
Texas to Obama is going to be California to Trump.
Exactly, and the federal administration, the Trump administration, is proposing basically allowing states to establish standards under the Clean Water Act. Now, California politicians will say, no, that's bad, because California politicians are acting in the national interest. But California will set the standards equal or higher to what they would have had under the Trump administration anyway.
You know, when I was in law school, they always had, kind of the general rule of what's happening in states, the minority rule, and oh, by the way, what's happening in California? So no surprise there. Dan, what about any other political stories you think we're going to be hearing about?
Well, let me say something about the Trump thing. I think at the same time all this is going on, there has to be some level of cooperation between Sacramento and Washington over things like paying for fire costs. This water deal that we mentioned earlier is dependent on having a signature from the President of the United States on some legislation. So we can get carried away too far. At the working level, the everyday level, there's still going to be quite a bit of cooperation between the two states as well.
You can't bite the hand that feeds you. I mean, I think that's going to be, so it's going to, Newsom's going to have to be be careful about how far they go with this?
He will. But also, as soon as the holidays are over, we're in the midst of the 2020 election, and we're talking about a March 3rd primary election for the presidential race and all other races here in California.
So we're going to see all these politicians trooping to California for a change. Not just to raise money, but to actually ask for votes.
Yeah, and 2019 is going to be a busy, busy year in that regard. Well, I want to thank our guest, Dan Walters with CalMatters, Scott Lay with The Nooner. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Kepler for The Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.